And we'll start. First time giving this talk. This will be interesting. A lot of material to cover here. So first of all, I am, as he said, I'm Chet Haase. I work at Google. I've been on the Android team since 2010. I recently switched roles there, still on the Android team. I'm now on the graphics team doing engineering, again, core engineering. I did core UI for a while, led a team for a while. I did developer relations, and now I'm back in engineer writing more code, which is always fun. When I joined in 2010, I basically got down to work. It was a really, really busy release, the busiest since I've been there, and also the worst. Fortunately, that one ended. Didn't really have time to think about anything else, but a couple of years later, it dawned on me that the way that Android began and the way that it became relatively successful in the world, I thought was a really interesting story. And so I waited for someone to tell that story. And when no one did, I decided to, which is what the book was about. So this talk is kind of about the book, but not really. I'm not here to pitch the book. I'm here because I think it's a really interesting story. That's why I wrote the book. There are different facets of it. Part of it is the history of how things began and the people that worked on it. Part of it is a premise of why did it work? And part of it is just a story about the journey of tech, Silicon Valley, the people in technology, and the inherent interconnectedness of all of it, which I find really fascinating. But first of all, why don't we start with some background? So we'll have a little, if we can get on the right window here, a little history lesson about Android itself. So everything began in 2003, unless you count, the people in the companies that came before Android that led to it. I'll get into that later. There was a company called PhotoFarm that was started by Andy Rubin and Chris White. And what they wanted to do was to build an open source platform for better software in cameras. Cameras were getting amazing at that time. DSLRs had come online, sensors were getting larger, lens hardware was, that's dated technology anyway, but really amazing. You could take these amazing large pictures, store them on these digital devices. It was all really cool, but the software was horrible. In fact, the software still is horrible because they didn't get to do that project. They went around the valley to venture capital firms, people with deep pockets, money to invest in things, and they said, here's what we'd like to do. Cameras should be better. They should have better UIs. They should have better networking, and we want to be the company to provide that capability. And the VCs said, yawn. They were not interested in cameras. There was no interest in investing in a company that wanted to improve that particular segment of the market. At the same time, cameras were starting to be integrated into the relatively horrible phones at that time. And so there wasn't really an obvious way for someone to, especially VCs, to make a lot of money from that kind of investment. Then a couple of colleagues of Andy's reached out to him, Rich Miner and Nick Sears, both of whom he'd worked with on the side when he was at Danger. So Andy Rubin had started Danger Inc. with a couple of other people, Joe Britt and Rich Hirschison, and Matt Hirschison, excuse me. And they reached out to him and said, you've got a really interesting idea there, but what about phones instead of cameras? And Andy didn't really want to do phones. He was burned out after Danger, but he was eventually talked into this. Rich and Nick helped develop the business plan for this, ended up joining as co-founders in this company that they renamed from PhotoFarm to Android. And then it was time to pitch that idea around. So they developed this deck. This is the title slide from that deck. They were walking it around the valley, and also VC firms on the East Coast that hadn't already turned down Android for the camera OS and saying, hey, we got this great idea for this open source platform. What do you think? They walked around to VCs. They ended up having meetings with Google as well. One of the key slides in the presentation, one of the key points that they had to make was this one. They said, well, here's how many PCs were shipped recently, and here's how many phones were shipped recently. And by the way, these phones are more powerful than the hardware that PCs had just a few years ago. So connect the dots here. Isn't there something amazing that could be done in the phone space? So it was a combination of the hardware for phone technology becoming more and more capable, as well as the numbers and the trajectory of phones being really amazing, especially compared to PCs, because PCs, sure, that's a really big number. Lots of PCs ship every year, and they still do. But if you look at the numbers, it's really flat lines. Like the people who want PCs have PCs. And eventually they replace those PCs, but it's not a growing market, right? On the other hand, phones were growing at that time, and they're still growing today. So this was the key thing that interested VCs. It was also the key thing that ended up interesting Google itself. right? So they had success with that pitch deck. They had 2 VC firms that were willing to fund the company in a relatively small way. And Google as well said, you know what, we'd be interested in acquiring you. And they had to think hard about that because they really wanted this plan to succeed and they didn't want to get sucked into a big company and then plans are dashed. I've been at a lot of big companies that have made a lot of acquisitions, and honestly, most acquisitions essentially fail, right? For various reasons. There's a culture mismatch. Founders take off as soon as they pocket the money. The company decides it's not the right thing, whatever, right? There's lots and lots of reasons for projects to fail in an acquisition or not. But they were very wary of that because they really wanted this project to succeed. But they were eventually talked into it. And then the acquisition happened. It happened in July of 2005. It's important to note, I saw somebody comment on Twitter recently, like, oh, well, Google acquired this thing and then they shipped this Android phone. Like, no, that wasn't it at all. Google acquired a tiny company. There were only 3 people doing coding at that time in that company. There were 3 engineers. There were the 4 founders that were working more in the business, some of the design side of things, and there was an administrative assistant, and that was it. They basically had a vision and a plan for what they wanted to do. And then they kind of pushed reboot and everything started again in July. Right, from the kernel on up the stack. So they didn't acquire a technology, they really acquired an idea and a vision and the people that could lead that vision toward that reality that they wanted to see. So when they were acquired, then hiring and building the platform began in earnest. They got there, they kind of established their feet for a couple of months, and then they hired, an engineer, another engineer, and then things picked up. They were maybe, 15 people by the end of that year. And then they, kept bringing people in to build the different parts of the stack as they sort of worked their way up the capability of this platform that they wanted to build together. So from 2005 to 2008, they were basically racing toward 1.0. We need to ship this thing. They needed to build the kernel. The kernel was basically the Linux kernel. They didn't need to build it as much as they were taking the Linux kernel and then adding things that were needed with this new market, this new platform that they were aiming at. An example of that is wake clocks. So if you have a laptop and you shut the lid, you're happy if it goes completely to sleep. You don't want that laptop doing anything and burning battery when you're not actually typing on the keyboard and doing anything. With a phone, you don't want it to go completely to sleep because you really like to receive that phone call that's coming in. Or if you're making a phone call and the screen turns off, you don't want the phone to shut off and cut off that call with whoever you were talking with, right? So there's this concept of saying, you know what, things need to shut down, but I also want the core operating system to stay awake. So that was a new concept for Linux that needed to be folded into Android because it was a new market, a new ecosystem that they were targeting. But other than that, the kernel was mostly there and just needed to be sort of robustified for the new constraints that Android had, as well as adding drivers. And that was really the key part of what was happening in the kernel side, was making that Linux OS talk to that display technology, this SoC, that memory bus architecture, that SD card, right? All the different pieces of hardware that it needed to talk to, that was the stuff that needed to get built. Bluetooth, there was the wake lock thing, there was, drivers for this and that platform capability. On top of that, you had the language and the runtime. So the language was an important choice because they needed to pick what language developers were going to target when they wrote applications for Android. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but obviously they ended up picking Java at that time. They had 3 choices. They could have chosen JavaScript, which is what the original demo was written in and was a very popular language for working on the web at that time, still is. And they also used C++ internally, and there was a big contingent that wanted to stick with C++ because it really gives you sort of closer to the metal control over what's going on in your program. On top of all that, they needed to build the framework itself, all of the APIs, all of the UI toolkit, for accessing this functionality. At the visual layer, they needed to build the graphics capability so you could actually end up with pixels on the screen somehow. Media, so you could have audio, ringtones, video stuff on your system. The system UI, so you have a way to actually launch those applications, do things like, navigate between them, see the notifications, see the time in the status bar at the top of the screen. And then on top of that, you had the applications that were being written internally and then eventually externally. Things, core applications that we all know now, like the ability to see your calendar or Gmail or Maps, like all of the stuff was happening. And it's interesting if you think about it, it's all happening in parallel, right? So they're building the plane as they're flying in the plane at the same time. They're building these applications on top of a framework that is just being constructed at the time. So there were a lot of sort of parallel and interleaved engineering projects where the person building Gmail was also helping out in the framework, because that person would require some capability that didn't exist. So then they would go in and actually write that capability. Right. So they're all kind of building everything at the same time and kind of hoping that it all works when they're done. Then they needed to build the services, right? Because it's not just about what's running on the phone. You've got data on the back end. So you needed a way for Gmail to talk to the Gmail servers back at Google, or you needed a way for someone to send a Gtalk message, for that to arrive on the servers at Google, and then for that to automatically be pushed to the phone, so that the phone didn't have to, run to a computer and sync data in order to see that they had missed a message. Instead, it's coming over the air through some persistent connection. So all of that stuff had to come online as well, so that you could get these applications to actually talk to the servers and the wider internet and web that makes smartphones so powerful. And then finally, you have Android Market, the ability for application developers to actually push their applications up, offer them for people to use, and offer them for sale for them to make money, to then write more and more applications for this ecosystem. And then you have the SDK that wraps together a lot of these developer tools, including the plugin for Eclipse that allows you to write and debug these applications, the documentation on the website, the reference documentation, the samples and the tutorials and all of that stuff, in order to make a nice developer experience, so that it wasn't just Google engineers writing software for a Google phone. It was all possible Android engineers across the world writing everything for whatever they wanted to do on those phones. So they were, from day one, or even before day one, providing these capabilities for the ecosystem of possible developers everywhere to help contribute to this platform, to make it a really rich ecosystem for, infinite users wherever they were. Then in 2007, an interesting thing happened. The iPhone launched. So in January, the iPhone was announced, and then 6 months later, it was actually made available. And the timing of that was Android didn't exist yet, right? Nobody knew about Android except, rumors were probably swirling around, but there was nothing available for developers or users or anything. Instead, it was all iPhone, iPhone, iPhone. And there was an interesting repercussion of this. There were smartphones out there available already. In fact, Danger had a relatively early smartphone in the early 2000s that allowed you to check email and messages, rich connectivity stuff, and almost real web browsing experience, not quite as dynamic, but otherwise made it look like, a real web page instead of this, dumbed down WAP web pages that were appearing elsewhere on mobile devices. So it was pretty good, but it was incredibly constrained in terms of hardware and capabilities. You had the Trio devices from Palm that were coming out. You had some early smartphone devices from companies like Microsoft. Nokia was starting to put its toes in there. Obviously, the BlackBerry devices from RIM were pretty good at doing what they did, sort of focusing on enterprise customers and communications with the hardware keyboard. And then the iPhone came out, and it came out with a touchscreen. Touchscreens were not new. They had been out for various devices before. And in fact, there was a touchscreen that came out on, maybe it was an LG device. I can't remember the name. Like just a few weeks before the iPhone came out, there was actually a touchscreen on a different device that didn't happen to be as successful as the iPhone ended up being. So it wasn't a new idea, but what it did was it sort of bundled it with all of the other capabilities of the early iPhone and made people realize, oh, this is a smartphone experience. And what Android had to do was basically switch project plans. So they were already planning on doing a touchscreen, but that was going to be the second device. So they were building in the capabilities in the platform, and then the second device for Android was going to be a touchscreen device. But the first one, which was called Sooner because it was going to come out sooner, was not going to be touchscreen. It was going to have a hardware keyboard, period. But they could tell, based on the reactions of everybody to the iPhone announcements and availability, that what they really needed was a touchscreen in the first device. They couldn't just come out with a BlackBerry competitor as their first device. So they killed the Sooner device, and they focused on the second device, which was then called the Dream device. And they said, okay, this is going to be the launch device for Android. And we're just going to focus on that. So they doubled down, finished up the touchscreen capabilities, and aimed at that first device, and also aimed at the SDK. So in October of that same year that the iPhone came out, finally Android came out to the public and said, okay, you can now develop applications. You can't ship them because there are no devices in the world, and the Dream device wasn't available even internally at that point. But they had the early versions of many of the APIs that you still use today as developers. So the developers could actually start playing with this thing so that when 1.0 came out, they could put applications on the Play Store on Android Market at that time and make those applications available to users. About a year later, in October of 2008, the team finished. They made 1.0, which meant a few things. So they shipped 1.0 itself, the actual fully baked final versions of the APK of the APIs came out in 1.0. They also shipped a device, the T-Mobile G1 in the US, and then eventually in other countries. And they stuck with their original plan. They open sourced everything. So after the release came out, they said, and by the way, here's all the code. And that was a really key part for making the whole Android thing work from the beginning, is making that code freely available to everybody, to users who were strangely curious about it, to developers who wanted to know how things worked and how they might work around some issues that they were having, or just to better understand the platform. And more importantly, for partners to actually be able to take that platform and then ship devices that they could base on that platform, which was a much different model than they were presented from other companies. Apple had its closed ecosystem. Windows charged them money for every version that they wanted to license for their devices. Other platforms were available, but required a lot of assembly to sort of put together. Whereas Android basically said, you know what, here's everything. Do with it what you would like to. In 2009, they kind of wondered where the users were, right? So the the G1 came out, the T-Mobile G1 came out, and that launched late 2008. And if you look at the graph, it's a little bit small here, but basically you can see that green line down at the bottom is very much at the bottom, right? It came in last place, obviously, because it didn't have any users to begin with, but for many, many months, it stayed right there down at the bottom. You had Symbian up top with, obviously all the feature phones, but it was also doing some smartphone stuff. And there were a couple of other manufacturers that were using sort of variations of Symbian on their devices. You had RIM, with its loyal enterprise base, doing very well, thank you very much. You can sort of see that upward trajectory, solid upward, stable trajectory for RIM. You had Apple obviously had started, and they were doing relatively well. They hadn't really taken over the world, but they had kind of a nice sort of steady growth curve there. And you had Microsoft, and honestly, you will always have Microsoft in any software game. And you just kind of assume in the back of your mind, okay, well, Microsoft will win, and then what do we do besides that? So that's what it looked like in late 2009 when the Droid launched, and I'll get back to that later. So the overall time frame we're looking at here is in late 2003. You got the founding of the company, and then they get acquired, and they work, and then the iPhone launches, iPhone releases, and then the SDK comes out, and then finally 1.0 launches about a year later. And then in late 2009, the Droid launches, and that's when the numbers start to tick up. That's when other manufacturers come in, and we'll see some of those graphs very shortly. And then in mid 2010, I joined the team. This was at the end of the Gingerbread release. We shipped that a few months later, and I started working on the Honeycomb release, which we shipped very painfully about a year later. And if you look at the graph that we saw earlier, so we've got this, sad little green Android line down at the bottom. By the time I joined, it was a little bit above that. But it was still, we were a solid third, fourth, fifth place in the list of contenders for smartphones in the market, and kind of wondering, okay, where do we go from here? Are we going to stick around, or are we always going to sort of stay in this middling ground here? And about 6 months later, we stopped asking that question, because then the phrase we used internally, probably externally as well, is the hockey stick, right? That's when you had this major inflection point and the graph went up, and it just kept going. And we came up from that sort of solid last place, and then we just kept passing the rest of the lines on the curve, because during that time when I joined, in the background, as Hiroshi put it, like the pipeline was filling, we just couldn't see it from the outside. All of those other manufacturers had bought into Android as a concept. They were building their devices, but all of that takes time. And then finally, those devices started to come out in the US and all across the world. And that's when the numbers really started to seriously tick up. And that's when the beginnings of, oh, I guess Android is actually going to be a real thing started. And then you get all the way to today, or like as of last May, over 3 billion devices run Android. So then the question I had to ask, especially after Honeycomb was shipped and I could have a moment to think about something else is, oh my gosh, how did that happen? Essentially, why did Android work? And I want to point out, in case it's not obvious from the history lesson back there, the success of Android, to the extent that we have it today and over time, was certainly not preordained. As I said before, it was a tiny startup. There were only 8 people that joined. It was 8 people and a plan. It wasn't any great product that Google could base the Android platform upon. Instead, it was an idea of what that platform should be. And some clever people came in, some clever leaders, and then they hired other clever people along the way, and they all worked really hard. There were incredibly successful, powerful companies with very, very deep pockets that were in the market at the time. Nokia owned phones across the world. They had something like 70% market share of all phones, right? Not quite as much in the US, but really phenomenally successful everywhere. You could just sort of assume that they would continue being the #1 player for quite a long time. RIM was there, as I said, incredibly successful in the enterprise market, maybe not as much with consumers. You kind of had to have this little thing sitting on your hip, which was maybe not a very trendy look for a lot of cool people in the world, but they were doing very well in the enterprise market, very loyal customer base. Microsoft was in the market. And as I said, like when Microsoft is in the market, a friend of mine in a company years ago said, if Microsoft is in your market, get out. You know that company in particular, they're really good at shipping software. So if the thing that they're shipping right now is not good enough, it will be, right? They're just going to keep plowing ahead, pouring money and resources and very clever people into it, and eventually they'll get it. So obviously that's not a good contender to go against in any game, mobile or not. And then the iPhone launched just to make the whole thing even more confusing, right? So here's another contender that nobody even saw coming. Incredibly successful consumer brand for computers, for laptops at that time. The iPod, incredibly successful consumer thing, but now they're in the mobile phone market. And what does that mean? And yet you could see, as I said, like over those next couple of years after I had joined the team, these dynamics of these graphs where all of a sudden Android was becoming incredibly successful. Here we're seeing Android compared to feature phones. So feature phones at that time were far and away the more popular thing for people to buy because the economics made sense. Like, yeah, maybe that iPhone was really cool, or maybe the smartphone concept was really cool, but that one cost, a few hundred, several $100s, whereas you could pick up a feature phone for, $50 at the Sprint store. And so it was an easy choice for most people in the world. Yet smartphones became more and more capable and the prices came down because more and more manufacturers were able to dive in and make that happen. And then people just started picking up smartphones by default, and smartphones overall, in fact, Android overall became more popular as purchase items than even feature phones. So as I talked to people and as I did all the research for the book and all the writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, several factors for Android's ability to do this over the years came up. One was the team itself, the people that were hired, the skills that they came up with, that they came in with and were able to capitalize on. There were a lot of key decisions that were made at the time by the people that were on the team and leading the team. There were also certain key decisions that were made very, very early on, the vision of what they wanted to do that they stuck to, that were also really important. And then finally, you can never deny the important factor of timing. And I'll get into all of these. So first of all, the team, one of the interesting things I noticed as I started working on the story and talking to people was how many of these people had worked together already. And I don't mean like, they've met in the coffee shop. They were like colleagues for years and years in several different companies. And it's more than I show here, but there were basically 3 companies that were large factors in Android. One was Danger Inc. So as I said, this was co-founded by Andy and a couple of other people early on, and they did an early smartphone platform. And many of the Android engineers had worked on that. The person that led the Kernel team, Brian Sweatland, worked on that. Ficus Kirkpatrick, Hiroshi Lockheimer was at Danger. Many other engineers were at Danger early on. There was another company called B, and B Inc. is an interesting company. I think if you're a consumer, if you're not a software developer, you've never heard of it. You never had a reason to buy a B device. You never wanted BOS. It was not a thing. Like I saw it from the outside. I didn't use it in the 90s. I wondered why this company thought it was going to compete with Microsoft and Apple in the OS game. Like it's like political parties in the US. Like I understand too, but whenever any person says, you know what, I'm going to run independent, I think, and you're going to lose because consumers do not understand more than two. We only have two fingers. We can only count in binary. We got 10 fingers, but we can only count in binary, right? And if it's three, that's way too many for our tiny little brains. And OS's same thing. So B didn't succeed. They tried many things to succeed. They tried an internet appliance. They tried getting acquired. They tried hardware. They tried software. Nothing worked. But a couple of very important things came out of it. One was that it was a cult classic. It was really popular with software developers because of some of the capabilities that they had in multimedia, in multi-threading, multi-core capabilities were really interesting just as software concepts that they envisioned very well. The other was in the people that actually worked at B. So there were several people in the Android team that had worked at B early on through the years, and then B got acquired by Palm, spun out to Palm Source. They continued working together basically on platforms, and then at Palm on some mobile platform technology as well, sort of building all these skills that would contribute to Android later. And then finally, there was a contingent of people that worked at Web TV, which was eventually actually very early acquired by Microsoft in 1997. And they, again, were working on platform software. They're building platform software, applications, UI toolkit, all the pieces that a platform needs, except for the TV market for that particular constraint of seeing this stuff on the large screen at the time. And so all of these people at all of these companies worked together for years. Some of the people like Hiroshi actually worked at all three of these combinations over the years. And then they found themselves together again on Android, and they were able to hit the ground running with these skills that they developed over the years and really get going very quickly on this complex platform they were about to build. They also had a startup mentality. So they were a small thing to begin with, only 8 people, and it was only like 15 or 20 people by sort of mid 2006. But they were driven like a startup, which is hard to imagine. If you're a big company like Google, yeah, we work really hard, but you know what? I also have weekends. I don't think they did. Like they basically worked. They went home, they got a few hours sleep, they came back to work, and they kept going. And this wasn't being driven by the leaders. It wasn't people saying, you must be here at 10 and you can't go home till 2 in the morning. It was the people on the team being driven to see this thing through. They were very emotionally welded to the capabilities that they wanted to enable in this. And so they basically drove it like a startup. Even though they were inside this incredibly successful company, they siloed themselves. They kept a separate culture, basically so that they could retain that startup mentality. And they were all working together, driving toward the singular vision as hard as they could. Excuse me. There was this great quote from FICA's Kirkpatrick, who has many good quotes in the book. The currency of Android was working hard. Putting in a shitload of hours was very valuable culturally. He also made the comment that he doesn't consider himself one of the best developers, but he does think that he can work really hard. He makes up for it just in the sheer amount of hours and effort that he can plow into things. And I think a lot of people on the team felt similarly. There were important decisions that were made along the way. Some of it was the technology that they built into the early platform that was really unique about Android and caught a lot of interest. Things like notifications, which were unique on Android at the time. Multitasking, the ability to easily switch between applications and recognize that users on phones are different than users on desktops, and they're really going to ping pong between these different things that all have very limited functionality, as opposed to running some monolithic application that's going to try to do everything for you. And finally, the functionality for form factor, recognizing that even though the G1 shipped with this particular density and this particular screen size, there would be other devices, hopefully, if they survived, that would have much different capabilities and much different sizes, and they needed to enable that from the beginning so that if an application developer wrote their application for this size device, it would also look reasonable on a different device that came out the next year with very different constraints and sizes. They built in developer tools from the beginning, recognizing that they couldn't write all of the applications. So they wanted to provide the capabilities for external developers to access all of the same capabilities. Things like language, saying you will have the ability to use Java, which most developers knew at that time, so they could build on their skills without having to learn some completely new thing just to write an Android application. They provided these public APIs so that external developers could access the same system functionality that the internal Google applications were written using. There was the SDK that bundled all of these capabilities together, including docs and tutorials and samples. And there was Android Market, the place for people to upload applications into the store. We take it for granted now between the App Store and the Google Play Store, but it really wasn't a thing until then. There were stores here and there, but they were highly curated and they weren't really massive ecosystems the way that we're used to now. So Android helped push that in a very big way. And that's one of the reasons that the platform is as large and pervasive as it is now, is just the availability of all these applications in a very easy way for people to download from the Play Store. And then there was the business calls that were made early on and along the way, things like, we are going to open source this thing, make sure the platform is available for all these other companies in a very easy manner. We're going to form this alliance of all the competing companies that are going to come together and say, we're going to work together. We think an open platform is a good idea. And that was kind of a really good sort of PR communications point for them to stick to. The compatibility was crucial. Like at that time, if they came out with a platform and one of these companies said, hey, that's great, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to fork it and do my own thing with it, then where would Android be today? So working really hard at the compatibility story between the CTS tests and just talking to all these partners and saying, here's why we need you to be compatible with all these other competitors of yours, because it's going to be better for everybody, and making sure everybody could stick to that point. Until today, nobody wants to be incompatible. You don't want developers to have to write for your device and then they won't work anywhere else, because then they're probably not going to write for your device at all, right? So compatibility over the years was really crucial. And then partnerships. If you think about the early Nexus devices, it wasn't just HTC every single time. We worked with HTC, we worked with LG, we worked with Samsung, we worked with all these different manufacturers to make sure that everybody felt invested in this ecosystem and didn't feel like, they were going to take over and be the one dominant player in that market. We wanted everybody to feel a part of this platform with us. And the acquisition was obviously a factor as well. The fact that Google had the money to actually fund the startup to begin with, but also acquire technologies when they didn't have time or experience to build it internally. The infrastructure, so that as Android scaled, Google actually had the infrastructure to scale with it. If you can ship videos on YouTube, surely you can ship OTAs to Android users in the real world. And then finally, a little bit more leverage with partners. Like, partners might not call you back if you're a small startup saying, hey, we need some developer boards. You might even charge that small startup a bunch of money because you don't really want to deal with them. But if you're Google calling, then maybe that partner is going to have a little more incentive to return the phone call and offer some assistance. And then finally, the factor of timing can't be denied. As I talked to all the people for the project, I kept hearing this phrase over and over and over again. Most of the people, I would say, why do you think the project worked? And everybody had their own ideas, but usually one of the ideas was they were in the right place at the right time. The hardware was finally getting powerful enough to enable these kinds of devices in a really good way. There were hiring opportunities so that all of those people with that experience could sort of come in together and start that bootstrap that early team very quickly. And the iPhone. And this is a weird one, because if you think about it in hindsight, you think, well, wouldn't the iPhone have killed Android? Yes, like obviously the strongest competition from day one when it was out there. On the other hand, what they did was enable Android. Think about it. If you are a manufacturer of phones and your name is not Apple, where is your profit going to come from iPhone devices? It's not. Right? The only hardware manufacturer that makes money off of Apple is Apple and any chips and other hardware vendors that it works with internally. And otherwise, everybody was cut out. Same thing for carriers. In the US, they launched on AT&T. Across the world, they launched on one specific carrier. What about the rest of the carriers? What if you're Verizon? What if you're T-Mobile? Where is your iPhone competitor? Because you're not making money off of the iPhone. So what iPhone did was it enabled an ecosystem that then wanted to come to Android. They saw the iPhone and said, we need something like that or something that can compete with that. And we don't have that right now. And we need it really quickly. Oh, there's this company, Google, that's been working on this Android thing that they told us about. Maybe we should go have a second look at that. And Android was there for everybody to come to. And then finally, another Ficus quote that I love that starts out the book. Anytime anything works out, if you don't acknowledge the huge luck factor, you're kind of a jerk. So obviously with any project, there's all the real reasons that contribute to it, but underlying it all is the fact that just everything happened at the right time and wasn't that lucky that it did. So now what? We've got 3 billion devices running this platform all over the world. So surely we're successful. I would say we're not successful, but at least we're still here. So we can keep working on this thing and improving it, because who knows what tomorrow brings. I worked at too many companies to feel like any company and any technology is here to stay, because anything can come up tomorrow and supplant it. But in the meantime, hopefully we can keep improving the thing. Hiroshi's got this great quote: competition never ends. It's relentless. Every day we're competing. It just never feels done. That's why I'm still here. So internally, we still feel that drive to keep making it better, because who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Really quickly, stuff about the book. That's what the cover looks like. That's what the title looks like. This is the timeline of the project itself. This is the timeline of the book project. So I joined, and then I thought for a few years, somebody should write this story, and then nobody did. So eventually I had an interview with Diane Hackborn and Romain Guy. And then I had many other interviews along the way. I started writing. I thought, maybe it'll be ready in about a year. And that obviously didn't happen. I rewrote it many, many times, and then I edited it over the years. And then finally, 4 years later, I published it, which is last month. The interviews that I did were a series of 5 questions. How'd you get into computers? I think the background of these people is fascinating. What were they doing on the Android team? And how did they get there? And why do you think it succeeded? Everybody had their own personal take on it. And then some stories along the way that got integrated into the book as well. It turns out that writing a book takes a lot of time. It took me 4 years for the overall project. Building Android from the acquisition to 1.0 took just over 3. So it took me longer to tell the story than it did for them to build everything that shipped with 1.0. The book is available in ebook. It's available in paperback. I'm working with the publisher to make it more widely available. I'm also working on an audiobook that should be more widely available. And I also want to point out, this is not a cash grab. I'm talking about the book not because I'm making money on it, because I'm not. I'm talking about it because I think it's a really fascinating story, and I want the story to get out there. I want other people outside of the team to enjoy it as well. All of the profits are being donated to charity, including Women Who Code, which is helping out with this conference, which is awesome. As far as the sequel of their book, there will be no sequel. I have told the story that I wanted to tell. I think we have at least 3 minutes for questions, and I'd be happy to take whatever anybody has on the chat. I know there's been a chat the whole time, and I did not have time to read it. Let's see. So I see a lot of comments. I don't know if there's questions back in there. Awkward silence. Gotta love Ficus. Ficus had killer quotes. I mean, a lot of people did. What I ended up doing, I recorded the conversations because I didn't want to take notes while I was talking to them. And then as I transcribed these for my notes, I realized these people are incredible. Like, they just have a really articulate and interesting way of telling the story from their own point of view. So as much as possible, I integrated their description into the book instead of just using my paraphrasing. But certainly Ficus had a really pithy way of describing things. San Mahat also had some really nice quotes in there. But yeah, the reason I chose the title, The Team That Built the Android Operating System, is it's not about the technology. It's really about the people themselves, who I find very interesting, very hardworking, very, very quirky bunch of individuals. And I wanted to, as much as possible, tell their story instead of just, the story about an OS.
Hi, Chet. I think we have one question in the chat.
Sure.
So one question was, how challenging was it writing a book? So.
Good question. If anybody's considering writing a book, I would try to dissuade you from it, or I would at least ask you why you're doing it. I really enjoy writing. I enjoy the process of taking something, especially something complicated and technical, and describing it, articulating how that thing works. That's just interesting to me as an engineer and as a writer. So I enjoy the process of writing, but what you don't realize as a writer, especially of books, is there's a really long process of editing, which I do not find fun, right? So you have to get as much joy as possible out of the actual telling of the story, because that very long extended editing process is going to be a real drag for a very long time. It was difficult, in particular this one. So I've written a few other books, programming and humor books. This one was more difficult because it's more of a journalistic thing for me to sort of research and interview people. So it was a new thing, but it's also a highly parallelized project that I had to describe, right? So all of these things were happening in parallel over many years, and trying to understand how to tell a serial narrative for a parallel project with different people That required many, many rewrites so that I could take something that was really confusing and try to put it down in the book in a way that people could actually understand, and not just programmers either. I wanted to write a book about a very technical project in a way that people who are not programmers would actually understand that. I'll leave it up to them to decide whether I achieve that or not. Maybe they're going to skip a lot of chapters, but that was the goal, which made it a lot trickier, but also more interesting. I see another couple of questions in here. We've been in trouble planning a simple application. It is a wonder how a team planned an OS release. I agree. Certainly all the pieces that went into the platform are very complicated. I think that's where all of these people coming in with experience building platforms before really helped out the project. They knew what they needed. It was still a lot of work, obviously, but okay, well, we're going to need a kernel. We're going to need a platform with these APIs. We're going to need a toolkit. Somebody needs to work on the Bluetooth driver. Like, they kind of knew the pieces coming in, and then it was a matter of finding the right people and spending the right time and then integrating all the stuff together. Is there anything that the team felt like they did wrong in the early days developing Android? I think we all, I had the saying about APIs that designing APIs is like building future regret. I think anybody that has built APIs or platforms or even software in general always can think about it in hindsight and say, you know what I would do differently next time is, and this is based on future requirements or seeing the people, the way that people use that technology, or understanding things at a deeper level, perhaps later. I think it's impossible to write and ship software without feeling that no matter what you are doing. There's certainly some feeling about some of the early decisions that were made very quickly because the team was just trying to get to 1.0 as quickly as possible. So making that trade-off between like thinking deeply about a thing and doing the right, perfect thing versus just shipping something. They tended to do the just ship something. And there's certainly some cruftier bits of, you know, the APIs or the technology or the platform that maybe they would do different next time around, or if they had had more time to think about it. On the other hand, like when I look at some of the rough bits of the API and some of the things that we regret, I think the fact that they did ship it that quickly means that now we're here and now we get time to actually fix some of those mistakes. We get time to go back and say, okay, this UI toolkit was fine, but people are having a hard time. What if we take the time to actually come out with Jetpack Compose? If we had taken the time to do that earlier on, we probably would have missed the window, right? But you do what you can when you can. You ship that thing, and if you're successful, then you're given a second chance to try to improve the things that are broken. I know we're over time, but I can keep going on these questions if I'm allowed to stay on the chat.
Yeah, you actually have until 1 o'clock.
Oh, right. Okay, great. Then I will. I'm trying to see, did wrong. How did you be able to keep track of the people, those who work in the very early days, and how did you contact them? I thought it would be challenging. That was one of the reasons that I really wanted to eventually write the story. Was I knew that two things would happen. People would move on and they would be difficult to contact, and people like me forget things, right? So if you talk to somebody 20 years later and say, what did you do on this project? They'll be like, I don't know. And I even got some of that from the people that had worked on it just, 10 years before or 12 years before. So I wanted to do it at a point where I could still get in touch with people and people still understood enough of what they had decided in those days that I could actually piece together the pieces of the story. Networks are good in that I would talk to one person and they would say, oh, you should really talk to so-and-so about this. And then I could, get their contact information from them or from other people on the team. So I mostly didn't have a hard time contacting people eventually if they were a really key part of, some narrative that I needed to tell. I should point out too, that I didn't talk to everybody on the early team. I do regret that in that it feels like, only these 60 people made Android, and that is absolutely not true. I tried to cover as much of the sort of core technologies as I could, but also at the end of the day, I needed to ship the book. I also needed it to be less than 4,000 pages. It's actually cut down significantly from what it was in early drafts, but I really needed to limit the size and scope just to make it consumable and also make it finishable by me. I see a question on the Slack chat. Does your book go into detail of how the team organized and communicated to build the first version of Android coordinating? I mean, it doesn't go into like methodologies of how they ship software. I think it was more pragmatic than that. In fact, by the time I joined, I think our methodology was you write the code and then you ship it, and everybody worked really hard together, and it was a small enough team that you didn't need like huge processes to, architecture committees to convene to decide, the right ways to integrate these different pieces. I think that is more and more necessary as a project grows, and as you have all the things, historically that you need to keep working, and API compatibility and different teams and different apps doing different things. But in the early days, it was really much more pragmatic about people just sitting down, being able to wrap their head around, the entire code base, writing the thing that needed to be done, and then moving on to the next project. I think you'd be horrified by the amount of process that didn't exist on that early team. Let's see. Is there a hardcover version of the book in the works? Yes and no. I do have a hardcover version that I am toying with right now, but I'm also talking to a publisher about doing a nicer and more widely distributed paperback version. And those two goals may collide at some point, because I will probably need to hand over rights so that the publisher can do the right thing for the overall book. So stay tuned on that one. When the iPhone came out in 2007, were there any features that were added as a result of what Apple shipped? Not that I know of. I think the Android team was very set on what they were doing, including the touchscreen. There was some quotes bandied about at the time that were basically wrong, saying, oh, well, Android had to reboot everything because now they realized touchscreens were important. No, touchscreens were actually in the plan. They were in that plan for that second device. What they did do was they reprioritized and decided to ship that second device as the first device. That's the main thing. Is I think everybody, Android included, realized, okay, the definition of smartphone now means there should be a touchscreen in there. And it's interesting, if you look at the G1, the initial decision was, well, there should be a touchscreen, and there should also be a keyboard, and there should also be a trackpad, and there should also be it was the Homer car of phones at that time, because the platform had all this capability and they weren't quite sure where the ecosystem was going to go. So they kind of shipped it all in the APIs as well as in that initial device. And then everything eventually converged, and people realized, a really well done touchscreen interface is probably the thing that people want more than also having a hardware keyboard embedded in this, necessarily thicker device that they're going to get. Let's see. Yeah, I love the Homer car analogy. I'm not sure how much it means to other people. Watch the Simpsons episode where Homer gets to design a car, if you don't know what I'm talking about. I think it's My Brother. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou? I think is the name of the episode. What do you think about Flutter as a competing to Android technology? I don't. There's a Flutter team working on Flutter. I'm on the Android team we work on the Android SDK for writing Android apps. I think you need to use the Slack channel to ask the questions. Actually, no, we're asking questions in both. Did I miss any questions? I got the ones at the end. I didn't look earlier in the chat.
Yeah, I think we covered a majority of the questions, Chat.
Cool. Then I guess I get to end on time and don't upset the organizers, which is nice. There is, theoretically, there's a giveaway of the book. At the end of the day, there's going to be in the closing remarks. So if you don't have it yet and you're interested, stay tuned for that. There'll be some really hard questions to answer for it. And thanks everybody for tuning in. This is fun.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks, Chet, for taking us through the journey of Android. And thanks everybody for joining the talk. See you. Have a good day.